Auction to the highest bidder. The Omega watched the Alpha King pay the price for freedom. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. Elena Hart stood at the edge of the auction floor with her hands folded tightly in front of her, the cold stone beneath her bare feet seeping through her skin as the lantern light swayed overhead and cast long shadows across the hall. The air smelled of dust and old parchment, and every sound seemed louder than it should have been. The scrape of boots, the murmur of voices, the sharp tap of a gavel testing its weight. Elena was an Omega, and everyone here knew it, not because she announced it, but because the way the crowd looked at her made it obvious, as if she were something fragile placed on display, something to be judged before it was ever understood. She kept her chin level even when the whispers brushed past her like a cold draft, reminding herself that dignity was the one thing no one could bid on or take away. From where she stood, she could see the long rows of benches filled with buyers who had traveled miles for this night, some from nearby towns, others from places she had only heard about in stories, and she wondered how far freedom really was if it could be measured in dollars and raised hands. The auctioneer cleared his throat, his voice practiced and smooth, and Elena felt her heartbeat slow into a steady rhythm, a quiet promise to herself that she would not look away. Then, just beyond the main platform, she noticed him, a man positioned slightly apart from the others, seated with an unsettling stillness that drew her attention without asking for it. He wore simple clothes, dark and unadorned, and though he said nothing, his presence felt heavy, like the calm before a storm that refused to announce itself. His wrists were bound, not roughly, but firmly, as if whoever had done it knew restraint mattered more than force, and his gaze was fixed straight ahead, calm, observant, and entirely unbroken. Elena did not know his name, but something about the way he carried himself made the noise of the room fade, and for a moment, the auction, the crowd, and even her own fear felt distant. She had seen powerful men before, men who used loud voices and sharp gestures to demand attention, but this man did neither, and yet it was impossible not to notice him. As the first bid echoed across the room, Elena inhaled slowly, grounding herself in the sound of her own breath, unaware that this night, which had begun with the threat of being claimed by the highest bidder, was already shifting in ways she could not yet understand. Drawn quietly toward the man in chains who watched everything with the patience of someone who knew that the true cost of freedom was never paid lightly. Elena's name was called, not shouted, but spoken with a deliberate clarity that carried across the hall, and she stepped forward as the murmurs shifted into attentive silence, her heart steady even as the weight of every gaze settled on her shoulders, because fear, she had learned, only grew louder when given space. The auctioneer gestured toward her with an open palm, explaining her placement with careful words that avoided cruelty but did nothing to soften the truth, and Elena listened as if the description belonged to someone else, a role she had studied long enough to perform without flinching. She focused instead on the rhythm of the room, the slow rise and fall of bids, the measured pauses, the way numbers floated through the air and landed somewhere just out of reach, as if freedom itself were a distant shore everyone could see but few could touch. She noticed how the buyers leaned forward when interest sparked, how some calculated silently while others followed instinct. And through it all, she felt the quiet pull of awareness returning again and again to the man seated beyond the platform, the one who did not raise his hand, did not speak, and yet seemed more present than anyone else there. His eyes met hers briefly, not with pity or expectation, but with something steadier, something that made her straighten her spine without realizing it, as if she had been reminded of who she was before this place had tried to define her. The bids climbed higher, voices layering over one another, and Elena counted them the way she once counted steps on long walks, a habit meant to calm the mind when the future felt uncertain. But then the cadence shifted, the auctioneer pausing longer than before, and she sensed a change ripple through the crowd. Attention drifted away from her, drawn instead toward a new item being introduced. and Elena followed their line of sight to the man in chains, now being acknowledged as more than a silent presence, his name unspoken, but his existence suddenly central. The auctioneer's tone adjusted, respectful in a way that felt intentional, and Elena realized that this man was not here by accident, nor was he meant to fade quietly into the background. She watched as the crowd reacted, some leaning back in surprise, others studying him with renewed interest, and she felt an unexpected tightening in her chest, not fear, but recognition, as though a story she did not yet know had just turned its first page. When the man finally stood, guided forward without haste, the room seemed to hold its breath, and Elena noticed how his posture remained composed, unbowed by circumstance, his movements controlled and precise. He did not look at the crowd when the bidding began, and when numbers were spoken, his expression did not change, but when his gaze returned to Elena, it lingered for a fraction longer, enough for her to feel the connection settle into place, quiet but undeniable. She did not know why her attention remained fixed on him, only that in that moment, the auction felt less like an ending and more like a crossroads, and as the gavel hovered, waiting to fall, Elena understood that whatever came next would not be decided by chance alone, but by choices made in the space between silence and courage. The gavel did not fall yet, and in that suspended moment the room felt smaller, as if every breath had to pass through the same narrow space before it could exist, and Elena sensed the attention shifting back to her, not because she was the most valuable item, but because she was the quiet constant in a night built on change. A buyer near the front raised his hand again, his voice confident as he added another amount to the total, and Elena noticed how the auctioneer acknowledged it with a nod that carried neither approval nor judgment, only procedure. She had learned long ago that systems rarely cared about the people inside them, and standing there now, she felt that truth settle calmly instead of sharply, like a coat placed carefully on tired shoulders. Still, something was different, because every time the bidding rose, her awareness drifted toward the man who had been brought forward, and she realized that the crowd was measuring him differently, not as an object, but as a question they were not sure how to answer. Some watched him with curiosity, others with caution, and a few with something close to respect, though no one said the word aloud. Elena watched his expression as the numbers climbed, searching for any sign of concern, but his composure remained unchanged, as though the outcome, whatever it was, had already been accounted for somewhere beyond the room. When the auctioneer paused again, asking if there were any further bids, a ripple of quiet anticipation moved through the benches, and Elena felt her hands tighten together without her permission, her pulse quickening not for herself, but for him. She could not explain why, only that the idea of this man being claimed without choice unsettled her in a way she had not expected, as if something essential were being misplaced. Another bid came from the side, higher than before, and Elena heard a few murmurs of surprise, but she barely registered them, her focus narrowing to the steady presence beside the platform. The man turned his head slightly then, his gaze meeting hers again, and this time there was an unspoken acknowledgment in his eyes, a recognition that did not ask for help yet did not reject it either, and Elena felt something shift inside her, subtle but decisive. She thought of the small possessions she had carried through years of uncertainty, not things of great monetary value, but things that represented time, memory, and survival, and she understood with sudden clarity that worth was not always defined by the highest number spoken aloud. The auctioneer cleared his throat once more, announcing that the bidding for the man would close soon, and Elena sensed the urgency rising, the crowd leaning forward as if drawn by gravity. She inhaled slowly, grounding herself the way she always had, and as she did, she realized that the night was no longer moving around her, but toward her, converging on a choice she had not anticipated but somehow recognized. The hall remained orderly, voices controlled, rules intact, yet beneath it all, Elena felt the unmistakable pull of consequence, the kind that did not shout or rush, but waited patiently for someone brave enough to step into its path. And as the auctioneer prepared to bring the gavel down, she understood that whatever happened next would redefine not only who was claimed, but who was truly free. Elena moved before she fully realized she had decided, her feet carrying her one step closer to the platform as the auctioneer lifted the gavel and prepared to end the bidding, and the sound of her movement, soft as it was, seemed to travel farther than it should have in the tense quiet. A few heads turned, surprised not by her presence but by her timing, and she felt the weight of that attention press against her ribs as she stopped, steadying her breath. She was aware of the rules, aware of the expectations placed on her, and aware that no one had invited her to speak. Yet the certainty inside her felt calm rather than reckless, as if the choice had been waiting for her long before this moment arrived. The auctioneer hesitated, his eyes flicking toward her with polite confusion, and Elena lifted her chin, not in defiance, but in clarity, making sure her voice would carry without needing to be raised. She did not announce a number right away, and that pause alone drew a ripple of murmurs from the crowd, who were accustomed to speed and certainty, not silence. Elena reached into the small pouch she carried at her side, her fingers brushing against the familiar weight inside, an object she had guarded through years of uncertainty because it represented more than money, and as she felt its edges, she understood fully what she was offering to give up. When she spoke, her words were simple, deliberate, and unmistakably clear, naming her bid without embellishment, and the reaction was immediate, not loud, but sharp, like the intake of breath that follows an unexpected turn. The amount she named was not the highest spoken that night, but it was final in a way that numbers alone could not explain, because it carried with it an intention that could not be measured. The auctioneer stared at her for a long second, recalculating not just the total, but the implications, and Elena held his gaze without apology, her posture composed, her hands relaxed at her sides. From the corner of her vision, she sensed the man in chains turn his head toward her, and though she did not look at him right away, she felt the shift in the room as clearly as if the air itself had changed direction. Whispers spread, questions forming without answers, and Elena became acutely aware of how still she felt inside, as if the noise belonged to another world entirely. The auctioneer cleared his throat, repeating her bid to ensure it had been heard correctly, and when Elena confirmed it with a quiet nod, the room seemed to pause, caught between what had been expected and what was now unavoidable. The gavel hovered once more, and in that suspended instant, Elena finally turned her head, meeting the gaze of the man beside the platform, and this time there was no distance in his eyes, only a focused attention that acknowledged her choice without diminishing it. He did not smile, did not speak, yet something in his expression softened, not into gratitude, but into recognition, as though he understood the weight of what she had done and accepted it without protest. The gavel came down with a single decisive strike, the sound echoing through the hall, and the auctioneer announced the close with formal precision, sealing the outcome with words that could not be taken back. A quiet stir moved through the crowd as people shifted in their seats, some surprised, others thoughtful, and Elena remained where she was, feeling neither triumph nor regret, only a steady resolve that told her she had acted in alignment with something deeper than circumstance. As attendants stepped forward to finalize the exchange, Elena's attention remained fixed on the man she had bid for, aware that whatever came next would unfold beyond the reach of the auction's rules, shaped instead by the consequences of a choice freely made. And in that awareness, she felt the first true sense of agency she had known in a very long time. The attendants moved with practiced efficiency, their steps measured and neutral as they approached to formalize what had just occurred, and Elena watched them without stepping back, her shoulders relaxed even as the reality of her choice settled fully into place. One of them asked for the item she had offered as payment, his tone courteous, almost careful, and Elena reached again into her pouch, this time drawing out the object she had carried for years, a small piece that caught the lantern light briefly before resting in her open palm. It was not ornate, but it was unmistakably old, its surface worn smooth by time and touch, and as she handed it over, she felt the quiet weight of memory lift from her fingers, leaving behind a surprising sense of clarity rather than loss. The attendant examined it closely, then nodded once, signaling acceptance, and Elena noticed how the room reacted, a subtle shift as people registered that the exchange had truly been completed. There were no cheers, no outbursts, only a collective awareness that something irreversible had just taken place. The auctioneer recorded the final details with ink and parchment, his movements precise, his expression unreadable, and when he finished, he stepped aside, making space for the next step. Elena's attention returned to the man she had bid for, who now stood slightly apart as the formalities concluded, his posture unchanged, though the atmosphere around him felt different, lighter, as if an invisible threshold had been crossed. An attendant addressed him briefly, confirming the terms in clear, measured language, and Elena listened, understanding that freedom, even when granted, often came wrapped in procedure. When the confirmation was complete, the attendant stepped back, and for a moment, nothing happened at all, the silence stretching just long enough to feel intentional. Then the man exhaled, a slow, controlled breath that seemed to ground the space between them, and he turned fully toward Elena for the first time, without the barrier of the platform or the crowd between them. Up close, she noticed details she had missed before, the steadiness of his gaze, the quiet confidence in the way he held himself, and something in her chest eased, as though her instincts recognized a truth her mind had not yet articulated. He inclined his head slightly, not in submission, but in acknowledgment, a gesture that carried respect without presumption, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, low, and deliberate, thanking her not with excessive gratitude, but with sincerity that did not diminish her agency. Elena nodded in response, surprised by how natural the exchange felt, as if this moment had been rehearsed somewhere beyond memory. Around them, the crowd began to disperse, conversations resuming in softer tones as people processed what they had witnessed, and Elena became aware that the auction floor, once so imposing, now felt like just another room she was ready to leave behind. An attendant gestured toward an exit reserved for completed exchanges, and Elena hesitated only briefly before stepping forward, aware that the path ahead was no longer defined by expectation alone. As they moved away from the center of the hall, Elena felt a subtle warmth spread through her chest, not overwhelming, but present, like a quiet assurance that the cost she had paid had meaning beyond the immediate moment. She did not know what awaited her beyond the doors, nor did she fully understand the man walking beside her, but she sensed that freedom, when shared, carried a different weight, one that reshaped both giver and receiver. The doors ahead opened with a muted creak, revealing a corridor lit more softly than the auction hall, and as Elena crossed the threshold, she realized that the true price of freedom was not what she had surrendered, but the willingness to step into uncertainty with her eyes open, trusting that the choice she had made would continue to unfold in ways she could not yet foresee. The corridor beyond the auction hall felt quieter than Elena expected, the muted glow of wall lanterns softening the edges of stone and shadow, as if the place itself were designed to let moments settle before they moved on. And as she walked beside the man she had freed, she became aware of a gentle shift within herself, not dramatic or overwhelming, but present like a change in the air before rain. Their footsteps fell into an unspoken rhythm, neither rushing nor lingering, and Elena noticed how the space between them felt intentional rather than awkward, as though some unseen understanding had already been established. The attendant who guided them stopped at a marked threshold and recited a brief acknowledgment in a neutral tone, referencing an old provision rarely invoked, a clause meant to ensure fairness when freedom was purchased by choice rather than force, and Elena listened closely, sensing that the words carried weight beyond their simplicity. When the attendant finished, he stepped aside without ceremony, leaving them alone in the corridor, and in that quiet, Elena felt a warmth spread through her chest, steady and grounding, as if something within her had recognized a truth she had not consciously named. The man turned toward her then, his expression composed yet attentive, and he spoke her name with care, not as a claim, but as an introduction, confirming that he understood the terms of what had occurred and the responsibility that came with it. He explained that the law the attendant referenced was older than the auction itself, a safeguard designed to protect both parties when a choice altered the balance of power, and as he spoke, Elena sensed the words settling into place, aligning with the calm certainty she had felt since making her bid. The corridor seemed to listen with them, the lantern light steady, the stone walls silent witnesses to countless such moments across time, and Elena realized that she was standing at the intersection of tradition and consequence, where intention mattered as much as outcome. As the man finished speaking, a subtle resonance filled the space between them, not audible, but perceptible, like a shared awareness that neither of them was alone in what came next. Elena drew a slow breath, surprised by how natural it felt to respond, to acknowledge the law not as a constraint, but as a recognition of mutual choice, and she nodded once, affirming her understanding without hesitation. In that instant, the warmth within her deepened, spreading gently through her arms and shoulders, and she felt a quiet clarity settle over her thoughts, as though the uncertainty she had carried for years had finally found a place to rest. The man watched her carefully, his gaze respectful, and she sensed that he too felt the shift, though he did not name it aloud, trusting that some things did not require immediate explanation. Together, they resumed walking, moving deeper into the passage where the light softened further, and Elena noticed that her steps felt lighter, her posture more assured, not because the future was suddenly clear, but because she had chosen to face it deliberately. As they approached the end of the corridor, Elena understood that the law now woven quietly between them was not about possession or obligation, but about acknowledgment, a recognition that freedom, when chosen with intention, carried the power to bind lives together in ways that honored dignity rather than diminished it. And with that understanding, she stepped forward into what awaited beyond the lantern light, ready to see where the path would lead. As they stepped out of the corridor into the open air beyond the hall, Elena felt the night settle around them, cooler and quieter, the sounds of the city muted as if held at a respectful distance. And it was there, beneath the steady glow of street lanterns, that the stillness shifted again, this time from without rather than within. A small group waited near the exit, positioned with careful intention, their posture formal, their expressions composed, and Elena sensed immediately that they were not ordinary attendants, but representatives of something larger, something structured by tradition rather than convenience. The man beside her paused, his attention turning toward them with a calm that suggested recognition rather than surprise, and Elena noticed how the space seemed to reorganize itself around him, subtle lines of awareness converging in his direction. One of the figures stepped forward and inclined his head deeply, addressing him with a title Elena had never heard spoken aloud in such a setting, a title that carried authority without arrogance, weight without threat, and the sound of it sent a quiet ripple through her chest. The others followed suit, their gestures synchronized, respectful, and unmistakably deliberate, and Elena felt the truth assemble itself piece by piece, not with shock, but with clarity that settled gently into place. She turned toward the man, studying him anew, and for the first time, she saw beyond the composure and restraint to the quiet power he had never needed to announce, understanding now why the room had responded to him the way it had, why the law had awakened so readily, why her instincts had recognized something before her mind could. He met her gaze steadily, not with apology or justification, but with honesty, confirming what the moment had already revealed, and he spoke his name, Caleb Ashbourne, without embellishment, allowing it to exist simply as truth rather than declaration. The title followed naturally, Alpha King, not delivered as a claim, but as context, and Elena felt the weight of it without feeling diminished by it, surprised by how little it changed between them. Around them, the representatives waited in silence, giving space for acknowledgment rather than interruption, and Elena realized that this reveal was not designed to overwhelm, but to align what had already been set in motion. Caleb explained quietly that his presence at the auction had been intentional, part of a longer effort to understand the systems that traded freedom as currency, and that her choice had altered the course of that effort in ways he could not have predicted but deeply respected. Elena listened, her thoughts steady, her emotions grounded, and she recognized that what mattered most was not who he was in the eyes of the world, but who he had been in the moments when it counted, when power had been withheld rather than imposed. The representatives finally spoke again, confirming the recognition of the ancient provision and acknowledging Elena's role in its activation, their words formal yet sincere, and as they did, Elena felt a quiet sense of balance settle between what had been taken from her and what she had gained. The city lights flickered softly in the distance, and Elena understood that the public revelation was complete, witnessed and recorded, but what remained between her and Caleb was not owned by ceremony or title. As the representatives stepped back, giving them privacy once more, Elena met Caleb's gaze with a calm acceptance that surprised her, aware that the world now saw him as a king and her as the Omega who had changed the terms, yet knowing that what truly mattered was the shared understanding forged in silence. The recognition that freedom chosen with intention had a way of revealing not only hidden identities, but the quiet strength that had been there all along. The representatives did not leave immediately, and Elena sensed that the moment was not yet complete, that something still hovered just beyond what had already been acknowledged, and she felt Caleb's attention shift subtly, not away from her, but outward, toward the city and the unseen audience that would soon carry this story beyond the lantern-lit street. He took a measured step forward, positioning himself slightly ahead without blocking her presence, and when he spoke again, his voice carried with quiet authority, steady and clear, intended not to command but to inform. He addressed the representatives first, confirming aloud that the exchange at the auction had been lawful, voluntary, and witnessed, emphasizing that Elena's action had not been coerced or manipulated, but chosen freely, and Elena felt the weight of those words settle around her like a shield, not imposed, but offered. The representatives listened intently, nodding as each point was stated, and Elena realized that this was not merely formality, but a deliberate act of protection, ensuring that her dignity would not be questioned or reinterpreted later. Passers-by began to slow near the edges of the street, drawn by the subtle gravity of the gathering, and Elena became aware that the moment was expanding, its significance no longer confined to those officially involved. Caleb turned then, facing the growing presence of onlookers with the same calm composure he had shown throughout the night, and he spoke again, his words measured, deliberate, and unmistakably public. He stated that Elena Hart was under his personal recognition, not as property, not as obligation, but as a woman whose choice had altered the course of an ancient law, and that her autonomy would be respected without condition. The words carried outward, met with silence rather than reaction, and Elena understood that silence was not uncertainty, but absorption, the pause that followed something unexpected yet undeniable. She felt her pulse steady, grounding herself in the reality of the moment, aware that her name now existed in a larger context, spoken not as a label, but as acknowledgment. Caleb turned back to her, lowering his voice so that only she could hear, assuring her that what he had declared did not bind her to anything she had not already chosen, and that her path forward remained her own. The sincerity in his tone dissolved any lingering tension she had not realized she was holding, and Elena nodded, meeting his gaze with a calm acceptance that surprised even her. Around them, the representatives concluded their role, stepping back with formal bows before dispersing into the night, leaving behind a street that felt subtly transformed by what had just occurred. The onlookers gradually moved on as well, conversations resuming in quieter tones, and Elena felt the city breathe again, its rhythm returning, though altered by the knowledge that something rare had taken place. She and Caleb remained where they were for a moment longer, neither rushing to fill the space with words, allowing the significance of the public acknowledgment to settle naturally. Elena realized that the reversal was complete, not in spectacle, but in balance, that the auction had not ended with ownership, but with recognition, and that the power revealed had been used not to claim, but to protect. As they finally began to walk, side by side, Elena felt a quiet certainty take root, understanding that while the world might frame this night as a dramatic turning point, what truly mattered was the steady, respectful way it had unfolded, proving that strength did not need to dominate to be undeniable, and that dignity, once honored, had a way of reshaping everything it touched. The city gradually receded behind them as Elena and Caleb moved toward a quieter stretch of street, the lanterns spaced farther apart, and the night air cooler, carrying the sense of something settling into place rather than ending outright, and Elena felt that calm certainty deepen with every step. She became aware of how different the world felt now, not transformed by spectacle, but rebalanced by intention, and she realized that the most profound changes rarely announce themselves loudly. Caleb slowed his pace, matching hers exactly, not guiding, not leading, simply walking beside her, and in that simple alignment, Elena felt the echo of the ancient law that had awakened earlier, not as a chain, but as a quiet thread of recognition. He spoke again, his voice low and thoughtful, explaining that while the law acknowledged what had occurred, it did not demand immediate answers or commitments, only awareness and honesty, and Elena appreciated the space his words created rather than confined. She reflected on the years she had spent moving carefully through a world that measured worth in rigid categories, and she felt a surprising sense of relief in realizing that she no longer needed to brace herself against expectations she had never chosen. When they reached a small overlook where the city lights spread out below them, Caleb paused, resting his hands loosely at his sides, and he looked out across the skyline, as if considering not what it represented, but what it could become. He told her that freedom, once reclaimed, came with responsibility, not imposed by title, but by conscience, and that he intended to use his position to question systems that thrived on imbalance rather than justice. Elena listened quietly, recognizing that his words were not promises made for effect, but intentions shaped by experience, and she found herself trusting the consistency she had witnessed throughout the night more than any declaration. She shared then, in her own measured way, that her choice at the auction had not been driven by impulse or expectation, but by a simple refusal to accept that dignity could be priced and transferred without consequence. And as she spoke, she felt the truth of it resonate within her, grounding her further. Caleb turned toward her fully, meeting her gaze with an openness that carried neither pressure nor demand, and he acknowledged her perspective without attempting to reshape it, a gesture that affirmed her autonomy more than words ever could. The moment stretched comfortably, unhurried, and Elena realized that the night was offering not closure, but an invitation to step forward deliberately, without fear of being unseen or unheard. As they prepared to part ways for the evening, Caleb assured her that whatever path she chose next would be supported without expectation, and that their connection, recognized by law and circumstance alike, would remain rooted in mutual respect rather than obligation. Elena accepted this with a quiet nod, feeling no urgency to define what lay ahead, only a steady confidence that she would recognize it when the time came. As she turned to leave, the city lights reflecting softly in her eyes, Elena understood that the auction had ended hours ago, but its true outcome was only beginning to unfold, not as a tale of ownership reversed, but as a story of choice honored and power tempered by restraint. She walked on with an unhurried stride, carrying with her the knowledge that freedom, once chosen with clarity, had a way of reshaping every step that followed, and that the path ahead, though unwritten, would be shaped by the same quiet courage that had guided her all along.